Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us to celebrate and think together about the Do I Have to Draw You a Picture exhibition before it closes tomorrow. And just very briefly, I'd like to say that the fact that this exhibition could take place is entirely thanks to the generosity and vision of Gifford Combs and Susan Lindhood, and so I'd like to thank them one more time for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank once again Prerona, who was just speaking to you, who's been thinking the exhibition through with me and organizing it from the very beginning all the way to today's closing event. The exhibition is organized around a core group of loans from the British Museum, so I would like to also thank the British Museum, which is represented here today by Catherine DAUNT, who is one of our speakers also. And we have an excellent roster of speakers, which includes, aside from Catherine, also John Blakinger, Michael HREBENIAK, and Kip GRESHAM. And Kip GRESHAM is also one of our lenders. I'm very excited that you are all here today, and very grateful for you engaging with the material and for taking the time to contribute, which includes, as I realize, both preparing the papers and also speaking on a weekend. So thank you again for coming here. And I'll introduce each of our speakers as they come up. I won't myself be presenting today because I've already done so around the opening exhibition, and I think it's time for other voices to take over. But just very briefly, I wanted to say also, in case some of you haven't seen the exhibition, the idea for the exhibition was to consider communication as a problem for art and as a theme for works in American and British art since the 1960s. At the pinnacle of modernism and American expressionism, artists such as Jackson Pollock turned painting into an act, as famously theorized by Harold Rosenberg's writing on American action painting. This was meant as a kind of to prevent the co-optation of art from capitalist commercialization, but by turning painting into pure presence, it also discarded any kind of communicative aspect. Artists in this exhibition acknowledge the importance of communication in both art and life, but they suggest that there is nothing straightforward about it. In a sense, they turn communication into a theme or into a problem, and they address it in a very diverse kind of way, addressing its different aspects. For one thing, through using media of communication as opposed to traditional media of painting or sculpture. Different aspects of communication that the artists in the show address is language, which also includes, in some works, body language, for example. Other artists will engage with metaphors for communication. So it's really a very wide spectrum addressing different aspects. And the artists in the show also, I want to say, they speak at different volumes, and some of them, making more activist kind of work, speak in a way that tries to elicit a real response, so to speak. Our speakers will address different issues in relation to the exhibition, and I'm very excited that they're all coming at it from very different disciplinary, or, well, not very different, but different disciplinary perspectives, and they'll each be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then there'll be a panel at the end, so we can all talk to each other. So we're aiming for about, I think, the event to finish after 2 hours. I'm very sorry to inform you that due to unforeseen circumstances, the artist Amalia Pica could not come today, but she has sent us a film so that we will be screening it instead of her presentation, and I'll read a short statement in relation to that film. So that's all from me. I'd like to welcome John Blakinger as our first speaker. John comes to us straight from California, effectively, where he got his PhD from Stanford University and where he was at the Society of Fellows at the University of Southern California. And he's just joined Oxford University as a Terra visiting professor, so we're very lucky to have him here. He is a historian of modern and contemporary American art, working at the intersection of art and politics. And he's just completing a book for MIT Press, which will appear in the spring, on Georgi Keeps, I might be terribly mispronouncing the name, in relation to art and science during the Cold War. So welcome, John, and thank you for contributing.
So I'd like to start by just thanking Elisa for the invitation to be here. And I also want to thank Perona for all her help with the many organizational details that went into the event. For me, it's a great privilege and an honor to be here in Cambridge, but also at Downing College. And I would like to then start by looking at a work of art. And it's a print from 1965 by the artist Eduardo Palozzi. And it's titled Wittgenstein at the Cinema Admires Betty Grable. An image appears above a text taken verbatim from a 1958 memoir by one of Ludwig Wittgenstein's students. The text explains the philosopher's peculiar habit of going to the movies after he finished delivering his lectures. He would sit in the first row of the theater, letting the screen fill his vision. He would immerse his eyes in a flicker of moving images. In Palozzi's rendering, the string of dot matrix code, recalling early graphic displays, and the caricatured cartoon forms of bodies, electrified by a technicolor spectrum, evoke this technological immersion. The image suggests the artificial dream world of Mickey Mouse, but also more terrifying technologies. Note the German Stuka bomber at top right. The result is a dangerously ecstatic absorption into the aesthetics of communication. The act of watching film turns into an act of becoming filmic, becoming mediated, communicational, informational. The fact that the work is a print, itself reproduced by technology, circulated as information, further reiterates its communicative function. Palozzi's work is a perfect emblem for the exhibition here at the gallery. That is our principal reason for meeting today, as it alludes both to concepts of communication through Wittgenstein, whose late work famously considered what he called the language game, and also the impact of actual technologies on communication. In my talk today, I want to historically situate this thematic interest in communication in the visual arts by turning to the study of communication in the sciences. To be sure, communication is an essential purpose of all art. But my argument is that it is also historically contingent, emerging in response to technologies and discourses about technologies that appeared in the mid-20th century. More precisely, I want to trace the origin of such interests to two key discourses that became intellectually dominant in the 1950s and 1960s: the information theory of engineer Claude Shannon and the cybernetics of engineer Norbert Wiener. Both discourses that attempted to make sense of communication technologies that transformed the 20th century, like the computer. Consider this diagram, an iconic diagram created by Claude Shannon that maps communication as the transfer of a message from point A to point B, from sender to receiver, from an information source at left to its destination at right. The message is processed by a transmitter and converted into signal, at which point it may be acted upon by outside interference, noise, that may distort or disturb its smooth transmission and ultimate legibility. If the message successfully arrives at its receiver, however, it is subsequently converted back into message. This model was very practical, very useful. It referred, for example, to how one's voice might be turned into electronic signals, binary code, ones and zeros, electronic blips and pulses, and then sent over telephone cables. After arriving at a destination, this code could be decoded, converted from meaningless data into meaningful sound. Shannon's model therefore allowed a theorization from a very removed philosophical perspective of the need to preserve signals against noise, a requirement for any communications technology. but it also became a metaphor. It was a model for maintaining clarity, for exchanging clear messages free from interference. It therefore also became ideological, an embrace of order over chaos, and this is something I will elaborate further a little bit later on. Information theory was preface to a more elaborate model of communication based on exchanges of information that resisted simple linear flow and instead operated through the logic of the network. This model came to be known as cybernetics. Rather than a one-way transmission of messages from A to B, cybernetics proposed constant exchanges of information in flux, a complex network of messages that responded to previous messages and allowed systems to adapt to environmental changes through self-regulation and self-adjustment. Such systems could be closed and thus easily regulated and adjusted, or open to outside noise. The name given by Norbert Wiener to his theory derived from the Greek word kubernetes, meaning governor, a reference to the way a servo mechanism controlled or governed a circular system through feedback loops, thereby maintaining homeostasis or dynamic equilibrium. Think of how a thermostat regulates temperature, or how thirst and hunger regulate consumption of food and drink. Like information theory, cybernetics was a highly conceptual model, and it too became ideological, biased towards order as a privileged goal in and of itself. It would be wrong to read these models as bland abstractions removed from specific social, political, and cultural meanings. They are schematic, but not neutral. For one, Shannon's information theory actually originated, paradoxically, as a theory of cryptography, or a, quote, communication theory of secrecy systems, a theorization of how messages might be encoded and disguised, hidden within noise. In his original thinking during the Second World War, the clear communication of information was not the goal. Rather, the point was to use noise as intentional interference in order to distort meaning. Such a theory was linked ontologically to military power. That was the very reason for him, studying cryptography in the first place. Cybernetics, too, was militaristic. Wiener famously popularized his theory by explaining its origins in his observations of the anti-aircraft controller, a device which used specialized computing technology to adjust the trajectory of gunfire from an anti-aircraft gun in response to an enemy airplane. In other words, the gun received messages from the outside environment and self-regulated and self-adjusted so that projectiles would hit the future location of its moving target. And of course, this brings to mind the bomber that's depicted in Pelozzi's print. So, this all brings us to the crucial question: how did the visual arts relate to these ideas? First, it is important to emphasize that information theory and cybernetics became widespread fascinations in the 1950s, applied from their narrow applications to communications technologies to a dizzying array of fields: psychology, biology, anthropology, political science, and even the arts. All were understood as disciplines of communication. Specific cybernetic principles could be read into any number of fields, a way to understand the messages sent between neurons in the brain, the function of hormones in the body, the behavior of social groups, the way cultural traditions evolve over time. Both information theory and cybernetics are paradigmatic examples of what the sociologist Jeffrey Bowker calls universal languages, discourses that can seamlessly cross intellectual boundaries, that communicate widely, providing common concepts for for understanding. Cybernetics actually emerged specifically from a series of interdisciplinary academic conferences called the Macy Conferences, named after the foundation that sponsored them, that united such figures as anthropologist Margaret Mead, computer scientist J.C.R. Licklider, Gestalt psychologist Kurt Lewin, mathematician John von Neumann, sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld, and so on. These specialists might seem to have nothing to say to one another, but through their use of these discourses, they could communicate, they could understand. These models of communication also had cognates in the visual arts. Art critic Clement Greenberg's canonical theory of modernism was a variation, in a way, of information theory, and I do not think it is a surprise that it emerged at the very same time. The maintenance of a pure message against a world of noise was transvalued into aesthetic terms, as the maintenance of a pure medium, the message so central to the visual arts, according to Greenberg, against visual noise, against kitsch, and a debased, proliferating mass visual culture. The purity of painting that emphasized painting through its fundamental formal qualities, the flatness of its support, the materiality of pigment on canvas, the specificity of medium, was elevated in direct contrast to outside noise, just as the preservation of an informational message was sacrosanct. Even Greenberg's successors seem to unknowingly mimic communication theory. The art critic Michael Fried's canonical theory of objecthood, his description of how minimalist works of art, huge, hulking sculptural forms, turn environments into complex systems by forcing attention away from the art object and out towards the interactions of viewers, might be understood as a displaced version of cybernetics. But by the late 1960s, these theories were also evoked explicitly by art critics in more programmatic ways. Most famously, the critic Jack Burnham generalized principles of communication in information theory and cybernetics as systems aesthetics. He embraced not only technological art that used servo mechanisms, consider kinetic sculptures fitted with motion detectors that moved in response to viewers, but any art involved in complex systems, like earth art's connection to environmental ecologies, as well as media systems, photographs, documentation. Burnham's methodological procedure, which involved applying theories derived from the study of communication technologies, has also been repeated more recently by art historian David Jozelet, who translates terms from contemporary digital culture, the lexicon of Google, into terms for making sense of art in the age of the internet. Such ideas became mainstream in the 1960s and 1970s with major exhibitions like Information at MoMA, Software at the Jewish Museum in New York, and Cybernetic Serendipity at the ICA in London, all of which encompassed not only actual communication technologies as new media art, but also text-based works of conceptual art. My long excursus on communication theory is intended to clarify the stakes for art that evokes communication, and to relate such concerns directly to their historical origins. While some artists adapted to the terms of communication, many others instead resisted them, and I want to emphasize this approach as perhaps the most lasting legacy of communication theory in the arts. I earlier explained some of the ways in which information theory and cybernetics were ideological, not only in their specific associations with military power, but also in the way that they privileged order over chaos. But both models were also ideological in more troubling ways. Consider, for example, how cybernetic principles like self-regulation and self-adjustment through feedback might be applied to the operations of the control society. Governments maintain power by calibrating their actions in response to social events, thereby reinforcing stability and the status quo, reinforcing order, maintaining existing power. Indeed, the very notion of the system or the machine as an epithet in the 1960s refers to the logic of cybernetic systems seen as mechanisms of social control. Such associations made these models especially problematic in the Vietnam era. I want to conclude by proposing 3 potential responses to these associations that I see in the works here on view at Downing College. First, I propose that artists mime and mirror models of communication in ways that seem so obvious, so deadpan, that they implicitly critique these models. These works appear to convey signals while actually creating noise. Jenny Holzer's painted sign could not look more authoritative, more declarative in its aggressive address to the viewer. And yet, its statement, quote, "How do you resign yourself to something that will never be? You stop wanting just that thing, you go numb, or you kill the agent of desire," end quote, is completely elusive. Communication and miscommunication are in tense suspension. Jasper John's Target with 4 Faces is extremely subtle in doing something similar. Are we looking at a literal target, the most direct of visual signs, or merely its representation, or maybe even a secondhand copy of John's own original Target paintings? These echoed references and shifting meanings play a type of language game, a confusion of communication that reveals meaning as arbitrary, constructed. Second, I propose that artists not only mime and mirror models of communication, but also purposely disrupt them, thereby disrupting the larger symbolic meanings those models represent. Such works create noise without necessarily conveying any signals at all. They embrace interference and confusion, frustrating the supposed clarity of sending and receiving messages. A work by Andrew Herman replaces the content in a tabloid broadsheet with an expression of a meaningless exasperation with noise. Conrad Atkinson screen prints a page from Le Monde but hides its text under gold pigment. These disruptions in systems of communication also related to more complex social, political, and cultural claims. Glenn Ligon's "I do not always feel colored" repeats the line in clear, classically stenciled font. But by printing the phrase at excess, by overprinting it, Ligon obstructs legibility and alludes to the simultaneous visibility and invisibility of race. Ligon's "I am an invisible man" similarly frustrates viewers' ability to decipher and decode by rendering the text, a fragment from the book by Ralph Ellison, illegible, by purposely disrupting communication in order to make a commentary on those who do not necessarily have a voice, who are not able to participate in such systems. And lastly, we might also identify a third and final response to communication, one that departs from the 2 other approaches I have just enumerated. Bob and Roberta Smith's letter to Michael Gove, a former British Secretary of State for Education, reproduces an actual letter sent by the artist to the government official protesting the government's planned cuts to funding for arts education. Its clarity of message asserts communication as a way to change social systems for the better. Similarly, Wolfgang Tillman's anti-Brexit and pro-EU posters use the visual culture of the internet meme to convey a simple statement, one that is sincere, not ironic. Today, in a moment of resurgent political crisis, information overload, and mass media confusion, think of fake news, for example, this embrace of clear messages, of signal, not noise, is a most optimistic gesture. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much, John. This was really great. Thank you so much for contextualizing. I look forward to speaking about it when we're on the panel. Our next speaker is Catherine Dawn. She is the Hamish Parker Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art in the Department of Prints and Drawings at the British Museum, where she's been for about 4 years now. And she was the project curator for the American Dream show at the British Museum, which has been very inspirational for this exhibition here at the Heong Gallery. She's also the co-author of the accompanying catalogue. Before joining the British Museum, she was at the National Portrait Gallery. And I just want to say the project that she's currently working on at the British Museum is a large bequest of a couple hundred prints and drawings from Alexander Walker, the film critic and author. Thank you, Catherine, for coming here.
Thank you, and I'd just like to start also by echoing John's thanks to Downing College and to Elisa and Perona for inviting me to speak here. I'm so glad I got to see the exhibition in the gallery before it closed. The British Museum houses the National Collection of Prints and Drawings, which comprises around 2 million prints and 50,000 drawings dating from the 15th century to today. Works on paper, and prints in particular, have long been used to communicate political messages. Compared to paintings and sculpture, prints can be produced rapidly, relatively inexpensively, and reproduced multiple times, so that the messages they contain are able to reach a much larger and more diverse audience than works in other traditional media. The British Museum has always collected prints that reflect recent history and the contemporary world. When the museum was founded in 1753, the collection included satirical prints by William Hogarth, which were then just a couple of decades old. Since the late 1970s, the museum has actively collected modern American prints, and the holdings of prints and drawings made in the USA since the 1960s has been significantly expanded over the last decade. The museum aims to tell the history of the world through its objects, and no story of the modern world would be complete without a strong focus on the recent history of the United States. Given their ongoing association with the communication of political and social messages, prints made by American artists in the period since 1960 provide us with an important insight into particular events, movements, and views held during this time. In this talk, I will provide examples predominantly taken from the British Museum's own collection of some of the ways in which American printmakers have communicated political and social messages through their work. I will look at their differing approaches to production and distribution, as well as to the art itself, and consider the audiences that these artists sought to reach. One of the reasons that prints provide such a good insight into the history of the United States in this period is that US artists took to printmaking in greater numbers than ever before at this time. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, the US was undergoing an economic boom in the 1960s, which led to an expanding upper middle class market for limited edition fine art prints. Dealers and commercially aware artists sought to cater to this growing demand. In addition, a number of important print workshops were founded in America around this time, including Universal Limited Art Editions, founded in Long Island in 1957, Tamarin Lithography Workshop, founded in Los Angeles in 1960, and Gemini Graphic Editions Limited, which was also based in Los Angeles, founded in 1966. These workshops not only provided the infrastructure for artists to make prints, but their founders and master printers, pivotal figures such as Tatiana Grossman of ULAE, June Wayne of Tamarind, and Ken Tyler of Gemini, encouraged the leading artists of the day to try their hand at printmaking. The 20th century is no time to be writing on rocks, Robert Rauschenberg famously said when asked to try lithography. But he soon found that the technique helped him to achieve on paper the combination of transferred photographic imagery and painterly gestural marks that his screen-printed paintings were also composed of. Andy Warhol and other artists associated with pop art, including Roy Lichtenstein, Klaus Oldenburg, and Ed Ruscha, also found that printmaking suited their approach to making art. Turning away from abstract expressionism, a movement that favoured the canvas, many artists of the 1960s were interested in the imagery of everyday America, in materialism, consumerism, graphic design, photography, signage, symbols, and repetition. Many found that printmaking, and screen printing and lithography in particular, helped them to produce the bold, flat colours of the commercial art that inspired them, and of course enabled them to repeat images, a feature so important in the works of artists such as Warhol, Rauschenberg, Johns, and Ruscha. By 1970, almost all the leading artists in the United States were making prints. In that year, the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale was conceived as a print exhibition, and in the following year, the Museum of Modern Art New York mounted a major exhibition of prints produced at Gemini GEL. Of course, not all prints made during this period were intended to communicate political messages, but the ability of prints to reach a relatively wide audience and the medium's capacity for reproduction meant that many were. Over the last half-century, artists in America have made prints about the civil rights movement, feminism and women's liberation, the HIV and AIDS crisis, and the financial crash of 2008. Some of these prints have been overtly political, aiming to raise awareness of an issue, to fundraise for a certain cause, to change people's minds and to put pressure on those in power. Others are less overt in their political messaging, hinting at a point of view, encouraging contemplation of a subject, but ultimately allowing each viewer to interpret the work in their own way. Among the artists who have taken the latter approach are Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, and Ed Ruscha. Warhol began to make prints in 1962, using commercial printing shops to produce screen prints on canvas and limited editions on paper. Famously interested in advertising and celebrity, Warhol's work held up a mirror to contemporary America and brought images of the everyday into the gallery. But although he declared himself to be deeply superficial, Warhol's choice of subject matter often hints at a deeper political engagement. In 1962, having made his name with images of soup cans and Coke bottles, darker subjects began to appear in Warhol's work in both paint and print. Among them, the electric chair, seen here in a series of 10 colour screen prints published in 1971. The image used is a photograph of the electrocution chamber at Sing Sing Prison, New York, which first appeared in Warhol's work in 1963, the year that execution by electric chair was banned in New York State. In the following year, 1964, Warhol made this screen print, also using a press photograph, of a scene in Birmingham, Alabama. A peaceful protest against segregation had escalated into violence, largely due to the heavy-handed response of the police, and this image was published in Life magazine as part of a photo essay by Charles Moore. The photograph Warhol chose to use shows a black man being snarled at by a police dog, his clothes pulled at by another. In the foreground, we see an officer wielding a baton. None of the African Americans depicted appear to be engaged in violence. Warhol instructed the screen printer to enhance the contrast between the black and the white, perhaps to reinforce the message about race relations. Warhol's first overtly political print came in 1972, when he was persuaded to make this colour screen print as a fundraiser in support of the Democratic candidate for president, Senator George McGovern. Using an image from a Newsweek front cover, Warhol depicted a smiling Nixon with a bilious green face and demonic orange eyes. Here the message is clear. The scrawled writing urges the viewer to vote McGovern, but Warhol can't resist subverting the conventions of a campaign poster by depicting not the candidate that he supports, but the one that he opposes. Although, of course, it is far from a flattering portrait, and the image of a malevolent-looking Nixon completes the sentence: vote McGovern or face 4 more years of this guy. Like Warhol, Jasper Johns began to make prints in the early 1960s, first making lithographs at ULAE in 1960. In both painting and printmaking, Johns has always been very interested in technique, in experimenting with different ways to make marks on the canvas or the paper. He has a repertoire of motifs that appear again and again in different media. Among them is the American flag, which first appeared in a painting in 1954. The flag occurs often in Johns' prints, as do maps of the United States, shooting targets, numerals, and numbers. Johns has said that he is interested in the things the mind already knows. He has taken everyday symbols that one might see several times a day and asked viewers to look at them again and to look at them in different ways. He plays with and manipulates these symbols, reverses them, removes all colour, adds colour, doubles them. Johns has famously remained tight-lipped about any political meaning in his work, indeed any meaning at all, but his use of the American flag in particular has often been interpreted as political. The flag, a symbol of a nation, the manipulation of a flag, a criticism of that nation. In this colour screen print from 1973, the flag is turned on its side, reversed and doubled. Orange and green have been added to the red, white and blue, and the ink drips down the page. The flag on the right has an additional layer of varnish, so that one flag is matte and the other shiny, now discoloured slightly with age. Take an object, John says, do something with it, do something else to it. Is John's manipulation of the flag here just about the image? Is the flag just a subject to allow him to experiment with and master different techniques? Or is he commenting on the nation that the flag represents? Do the drips indicate some kind of disintegration? Viewers, curators and art historians have interpreted John's work in various ways, and perhaps this is what he intended. Perhaps the ambiguity is part of the message itself, and it is perhaps the potential for an image to be seen and understood in a variety of ways that Johns is most interested in. Other artists have used the stars and stripes in a more direct way. In 1967, for example, William Copley contributed this screen print to the portfolio Artists and Writers Protest Against the War in Vietnam, which was intended to raise awareness and raise funds for the campaign against the Vietnam War. Copley has turned the flag from red, white and blue to black and white, and he has removed the stars, urging the audience to think. Many artists made work protesting against the war in Vietnam, including Sigmund Bellers, who made a series of etchings called Gift of America between 1966 and 1968 to support the group Artists Against Racism and the War in Boston, Massachusetts. They included these very powerful figurative images of military attacks on women and children, which leave the viewer in no doubt about the message of the work. Addressing the subject of race, Emma Amos is another artist who has appropriated the US flag to make a political point and to urge her viewers to think. In this monoprint from 1995, the African-American artist has replaced the stars with a photograph of a black family in America taken in the mid-20th century. The red stripes resemble bloody smears and are cut through with a cross. In her work, Amos has often addressed the absence of black people from America's national narrative. Here, she inserts the story of black Americans into the nation's symbol, the flag, while at the same time apparently rejecting it. This is not her symbol, at least not until it acknowledges her story. Both race and war are themes that many artists have made prints about in America. In 1970, Robert Rauschenberg made this screen print summing up the tumultuous decades that had just ended. We see three political figures, JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, all by now assassinated. The images of soldiers in Vietnam, of a black man bleeding on the street in Detroit, and of students holding a peace protest as Janis Joplin, Rauschenberg's friend and fellow Texan, wails into a microphone at the top, just months before she died of a drug overdose. But a moment of triumph is offered in the foreground as we see Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon reflected in Buzz Aldrin's visor. The great national achievement of the previous year signals perhaps better times to come. But Rauschenberg may have been overly optimistic. The war continued, and in 1974, James Rosenquist made this large-scale colour lithograph and screen print across 4 sheets, based on a painted installation he produced a decade earlier. Rosenquist's training as a commercial billboard painter can be discerned in the work, which depicts an F-111 fighter jet of the type the Americans used in Vietnam, cutting through images of American consumerism. Laid out in full, the complete work is the length of a real-life F-111 jet, as can be seen here when the print was on display at the British Museum last year. The print was made in the year that Richard Nixon, who had faced much criticism for escalating the United States military intervention in Vietnam and Cambodia, was forced to resign as a result of the Watergate scandal. The president had been found to be a liar, and many Americans felt duped. There is a sense of urgency in much of the art made around this time, not least in this print made by Bruce Nauman in 1973. In the same year, Oyvind Falström, a very left-wing, politically engaged artist who grew up in Sweden, produced this lithograph titled Sketch for World Map. Falström believed strongly that art should be democratic. It was his hope that printmaking would allow him to reach a wide audience, and he initially sought to produce prints for the price of a book or a record by publishing very large unsigned editions, although he ultimately found this financially unsustainable. Still, his prints were produced in relatively large editions, this one published in an edition of 150. Using comic book type imagery, speech bubbles, and explanatory text, Falström's world map highlights the damage inflicted on the world by the political, social, and economic interests of the United States and other dominant powers. The print was made to benefit the Youth International Party, a countercultural group whose members were active in the anti-war movement. The Cold War also provided a subject for American artists during this period. In 1967, Jim Dine ridiculed two world figures on opposite sides of the Cold War by depicting President LBJ and Chairman Mao in gaudy makeup. Later, in 1990, as the Iron Curtain fell, Richard Archwager made this etching based on a news photograph of the new American embassy in Moscow, which had recently been found to be riddled with sophisticated bugging devices by the Soviet construction workers who built it. The Van Gogh-inspired swirls seem to represent the sound waves emanating from the building, while a shadowy figure with a briefcase walks by. Espionage and the work of the secret services are also themes that have been of interest to Jenny Holzer, who made this series of 5 photo etchings in 2006 titled AKA 1 to 5. The series reproduces 5 pages from a document from the FBI file on George Orwell, obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. The document is so heavily redacted that only one line is legible, and each page is annotated with the legal justification for the redactions. The result is a work of art that looks almost abstract, like a minimalist print by Bryce Marden or Donald Judd, but one which calls to question the US government's use of personal information, spying, and the meaning of the word freedom in the phrase freedom of information. May Stevens is another artist who has made prints on the subject of war. She and her husband Rudolf Baranek were both deeply engaged in politics and made work protesting against the war in Vietnam and supporting the civil rights movement. From the late 1960s, Stevens also became very involved in second-wave feminism and was part of a group of women artists who founded the feminist magazine Heresies in 1976, in which her work often featured. In this screen print from 1971, several of Stevens' concerns intersect. At the centre is the Big Daddy figure who appears in many of her paintings, prints and drawings. Based on a photograph of her father, with whom she had a difficult relationship, Big Daddy represents the racist, white, complacent, unthinking and yet dominant male figure in small-town America that Stevens saw around her hometown in Massachusetts. Here he sits naked, looking smug and accompanied by his ever-present bulldog who is wearing a patriotic vest. Big Daddy is surrounded by symbols of oppressive patriarchal groups, including the police, the military, and the KKK, with cut-out tabs to show that as a man, Big Daddy could occupy any of these positions of power. Stevens and other women artists involved in the feminist movement often became involved in cooperatives and collectives to counteract the difficulties faced by women in the traditional gallery system. Women were, and still are, as we know, greatly underrepresented in public museums and often struggled to obtain representation and therefore sales. This is one of the reasons that Stevens co-founded Heresies magazine, to provide a platform for herself and other women artists. Other women printmakers found other ways to circumvent the gallery system. In 1979, Ida Appleby produced a series of small printed artist books called Dyspepsia Works, a Performance, which she mailed out unsolicited to various individuals. This is an example of one of the books from the series called Sure I'm Sure. Appleby's work is concerned with domestic relationships, the power dynamics between men and women, and sexuality and gender. taking a comic strip type format and presented as a series of scenes viewed through a window or on a stage. Each book depicts an encounter, a domestic encounter or situation. The meaning of each image is ambiguous, but the disquieting captions provide clues. In Sure I'm Sure, an image of a man undressing above a woman on a bed who appears vulnerable with her arms folded is repeated over and over. Sure I'm sure, we surmise, is the woman's phrase. It appears to be about consent. Does she want to have sex? Does she really have a choice? Will submitting to this act mean she is destined for a domestic life as a wife and mother? Appelbrug has said of her images, the meaning shifts with everyone who comes to the work, whether they're male, female, old, young, middle-aged, from different backgrounds. Everything is very personal. You come to my work with your baggage and your life experiences. In the 1980s, the Guerrilla Girls, an anonymous collective of women artists, were more direct in their feminist messaging. Designing and printing posters and limited edition prints, the Guerrilla Girls created art that was meant to change minds, change actions, and change societies, that was urgent. They initially formed as a reaction to the tiny percentage of women artists included in an exhibition surveying contemporary American art at MoMA in New York in 1985. They produced this poster a few years later, appropriating Ingres' famous painting Le Grand Odalisque of 1814. They pointed out the small percentage of women artists whose work was shown in the Metropolitan Museum in comparison to the large percentage of nudes on display in the museum that were female. The nude here is anonymized by a gorilla mask of the type the artists wear when they appear in public to hide their identities. The group ran the poster as an advertisement on New York City buses so that it was widely seen by a non-traditional art audience, and it has since been produced as a limited edition colour lithograph, as well as on t-shirts, bags, cups, and other objects, all produced and sold by the collective. The group, which has changed in membership over the years, continues to use art to protest against sexism in the art world and elsewhere, as well as to address other social and political issues such as war, abortion rights, homelessness, and censorship. In the 1980s and 1990s, artists involved in making work to raise awareness of the HIV/AIDS crisis and the American government's perceived lack of response also made posters and displayed art in public to reach as wide an audience as possible. Keith Haring famously made murals and chalk drawings in public places around New York. In 1989, he produced this offset colour lithograph for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, known as ACT UP, a direct action group founded in New York in 1987, with which he was heavily involved. ACT UP produced posters and other printed material from the outset, with Haring and other artists, notably David Wojnarowicz, also producing limited edition prints to be sold to raise funds. The Canadian collective General Idea also made work about the AIDS crisis. Appropriating Robert Indiana's ubiquitous love design of the 1960s, General Idea created this AIDS logo, which was produced in a number of different formats, including wallpaper, posters, postage stamps, and magazine covers, and was displayed in cities around the world. They wanted it to be seen by as wide an audience as possible and to spread across the globe like an image virus. 4,500 posters were posted on the New York subway alone. In recent years, artists in America have continued to make prints about political topics. Printmaking has become increasingly central to the work of Kara Walker, for example, whose art focuses on racial identity and the legacy of slavery in the United States. In this etching in aquatint made in 2009, she uses her characteristic silhouette style to depict the head of a black slave held in a bridle of the type used to punish slaves by preventing them from talking, lying down, or running away. In an earlier print from 2005, the head of a black slave is superimposed on a scene from a pictorial history of the Civil War published in 1866. Like Emma Amos, Walker seeks to include the history of black people into a national narrative that has so often sidelined or even completely ignored their stories. Walker's images are incredibly powerful, not least because of her stark use of black and white. Glenn Ligon, as we've seen from John's talk, is another African-American artist who also often makes work in black and white on the subject of racial identity. In these etchings from 1992, which we've already seen, he uses text from Zora Neale Hurston's 1928 essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, and Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, Invisible Man. The words are difficult to read, particularly the words from Ellison's novel, which are barely legible against the black paper, echoing the experience of the invisible protagonist of the novel, a black man living in New York. Finally, I'd like to finish with some very recent examples of political printmaking. In 2014, Ed Ruscha produced a series of rusty signs, moulded paper prints made to look like rusting metal signs, bearing messages such as cash for tools and dead end. Like John's, Ruscha has rarely spoken about the meaning of his work and has often denied political interpretations. However, made shortly after the financial crisis and only 2 years before Donald Trump's election to president, Ruscha seems to be saying something here about the decline of manufacturing in America, the Rust Belt, and the economic downturn in general. The recreated bullet holes certainly seem to speak of an ennui that can only be present in a disaffected and failing society. In slight contrast, I will end with this very overtly political print, which leaves the viewer in no doubt about the artist's own views. In Unprecedented, a lino cut made by Sue Coe in 2017, the newly elected President Trump is seen violating the Statue of Liberty, a clear comment both on the president's alleged sexually inappropriate behaviour, particularly his pussy-grabbing comments, and his perceived threat to civil liberties. The title refers both to his unstatesmanlike behaviour and also mocks him for one of his frequent social media blunders in which he misspelt the word unprecedented, intending to mean never before. As this lino cut and the recent work by Ed Ruscha shows, artists in America continue to make prints to communicate political messages, some urgent and direct, others more ambiguous, perhaps relying more on the two-way relationship between the artist's thoughts and experiences and those of the viewer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for giving us this great talk about the relation between print and politics, and also this incredible overview of prints, and also this overview of what's being held by the British Museum, a lot of works that I think people wouldn't normally associate with the British Museum. So it's really great to have a little bit of insight. And I think people can view these works in your study room. Is that correct? Our next speaker will continue with the topic of prints. He's Kip Gresham, a master printer who has been working with artists for more than 40 years. He's based here in Cambridge at the Cambridge Print Studio, but he's worked with he's worked with artists including Joseph Cassutt, Conrad Atkinson, Eduardo Paolozzi, who were all included from his collection in the show. Beyond that, he's also worked with Paula Rigo, with Elizabeth Frank, Ellen Davies, Stephen Chambers, and many artists who are Royal Academicians. He's a very close friend of the college, and we're really glad to have him here and speak more directly about his experience of working with artists, and I suppose also the communications maybe that take place in that process.
I'm not sure how to make everything disappear. Is that all right? I'll just... It's all right.
Good afternoon. Thanks to the college for this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you for turning out on a wet and grisly day. Unlike the two speakers before, what I bring you are really dispatches from the front line. The nature of making prints is one which involves a very, very, very close communication about how it is to be, what its intention is, and so on. And when I first went to art school this stuff, this Palazzi, was around, J.G. Ballard said, if everything was wiped off the face of the earth and all we were left with was Palazzi's work, we'd be able to reconstruct the nature of the society. And in a sense, he's right, because Eduardo stole from here, there, and everywhere, re-evaluated things and so on. Anyway, when I first started working with him, it was very odd, because he assumed that I knew him, knew how he thought, knew what it was about. And it's interesting that we're here talking about communication, about the nature of visual language, because each artist speaks their own language, and each viewer interprets that language in their own way. And so when trying to climb inside Eduardo's head was extraordinary. And it doesn't move on. So I have to do probably that. That's good. Wittgenstein is the philosopher of language. He's the sort of the one that many artists attach themselves to, like Jasper Johns and so on. And these images of Wittgenstein, overlaid with mathematical diagrams and so on, were brought together by Eduardo, and it's called A Picture of Facts, which is taken from Wittgenstein's little gnomic phrase. And it's built up of many layers. Each layer is editable, each layer will carry a different intention, but it exists because Eduardo brought me a load of bits and said, we're going to make something. And he left me with some photographs of Wittgenstein, he left me with some mathematical diagrams, and said, here you go, have a play with that. And this appears to be an artist handing over his authorship, but actually he always reclaims his authorship. Things get chopped up, reworked, rebuilt, and the extraordinary thing about a Palazzi is that you would never mistake it for anybody else, no matter how many hands it's been through, no matter how many times it's been re-evaluated, it always has his stamp. And maybe that's revealing about the nature of visual language, the fact that it is so precise. And the thing about connecting with this man was, first of all, growing to understand his intelligence, which was shattering. The next thing was that he connected first with my children, because he had a museum of toys. My kids would hunt down toys and give them to him. And then he would give them plaster sculptures in exchange, which I always saw as a very good deal. I'll just move on one step further. This, I think, is probably one of the best prints Eduardo made. I know everyone loves the patterned, structured things and so on. This is called Monotype 9 Heads, and it's in 42 colours, actually. And it's an edition of 40, none of which are the same as each other. So we started printing colour 1 of 40 onto 90 sheets. They were then, we printed colour 1 onto 10 of 90 sheets. Then we printed colour 2 onto 10 of 90 sheets, and colour 3, and so on. And they were shuffled each time like a pack of cards. So that by the time we'd done 4 or 5 colours, they were all random. Some had 2 colours in the same place, some had, all kinds of things. And we went on and on and on and on until we came to the end of the list. And then he went through the pile and ripped up the ones that were no good. And I said, well, what about the possibility that there might be a sheet with nothing on it? And he said, well, you can have that as your printer's proof if you like. Anyway, I got one. This is mine. Many, many layers of meaning, both in terms of the portraiture, the types of language. he liked using diagrammatic things like the maths, you know, mathematical drawings, because they spoke in a different way. They alluded to a different world. And also it's to do with the nature of the portrait. You know, if you have one person's eyes and another person's mouth, who on earth is it? Right, this is from the Turing Suite, and that's really why I'm here to talk about Palazzi at all. There's one in the exhibition. I should warn you that I'm talking mostly about 3 pieces of work, of which I have no slides, because they're in the show. This is from the Turing Suite. When we set out to make it, I'd been looking at all those things like As Is When, Calcium Nightlight, and so on, all the other Palazzi suites. And I'd made about 40 individual prints with him by this point, so we understood each other. And I wanted to work on something serial. I wanted to work on something where making number 1 would affect number 2, and number 3, and number 4, but it was all wrapped around one idea. And somewhere around this point, he'd been reading Andrew Hodge's biography of Alan Turing, and he was very interested in the idea, as has been alluded to earlier on, of messages which are masked, and also the idea that the machine and the man, or the machine and the human, can fuse together. So what we set out to make was something in which computers functioned very heavily, and the hand functioned very heavily, but you couldn't tell where one started and the other started. And what you're looking at here is something which is built by hand, then by computer for deconstruction, then reworked by hand, and then reworked by computer, till eventually an artwork exists in about 20 separate layers. Some of them are 10, some of them are 6, whatever, but I don't know how many in this one. But it's broken down into many layers, all of which are manipulated, chopped up, and re-edited. And then it goes together. And in terms of the imagery, there are references to the mechanical and so on. But one of the things that I like that runs right the way through the Turing Suite is the sense of playfulness. There was something in Alan Turing which kept harking back to his childhood, to his joy in reading Alice in Wonderland and so on, and in little steam trains and things. So the collision between heavy mathematics, the development of computers, code breaking, wartime, and steam trains, and so on, is all going on at the same time. And you can gather from what I was saying about Eduardo with the toys before, that informs it, that's how it is. And so being inside one of these people's heads is essential, because he gives me the stuff to play with, takes it back, I play with it again, and so on, and so on, and so on. And in a sense, I'm like the musician playing somebody else's composition. Right, out of Eduardo, and I'm now going to talk about Joseph Kosuth. I don't have a slide of his work, but if you go and have a look at the show, you'll see it. It is a piece of text, and it contains the words, "People use language to disguise meaning," amongst other things. It's a piece from an unreal novel. Now, I can illustrate the nature of failure of meaning, in that when we were working on the print for this, I said, okay, Joseph, I've got the text, it's been set as you want it. How would you like it printed, and what would you like it printed on? And he said, well, you can screen print it, but I'd like it printed on vellum. Now, if you're American, this means one thing. If you're British, it's something else. So I got in touch with my paper supplier, and I said, look, I'm going to need about 120 sheets of vellum. How much is the skin? The goat skin. And I said, by the way, they need to be 20 2 by 30 inches. And I said, well, they're very big goats, but we'll see what we can find. And anyway, he came back with a price, I think, of about, this was some years ago, about £180 a sheet. So I phoned up Joseph and said, look, because this was being done for the Freud Museum, you're going to bankrupt the museum. I said, you know, vellum is very expensive. And he said, vellum. Of course, you misunderstand me. Vellum is what we call cartridge in America. Sorry, it's a little aside. But it illustrates how cultural attachments to a word change meaning. And anyway, this piece by Joseph was made as part of a Freud portfolio, Freud Museum portfolio, and I've got 3 other things from that same folio for you to look at to see the context into which it was going. If any of you have been to the Freud Museum, it's in Maresfield Avenue in London, and it's very interesting. There's Freud's couch, and there's all his art objects, and you begin to get some sense of the strange life they had. You know, their equivalent of watching TV was looking at little slides of mouse hair or something at night. This is Patrick Caulfield. It's Freud's Smoke. You'll understand the joke that goes with this, again, linguistics, that the smoke is graphic smoke, but also a cigar is a smoke. It's not great, but it's a nice enough joke. But the image is fabulous because it taps right into Austria in about 1938 when Freud left. This is by Paul Wunderlich from the same series, a German who, as a youngster, was like Günter Grass, part of the Hitler Youth and so on, and spent a lot of his life undoing in his head all that stuff. The Kasuth is fascinating because it's just words on paper, and the words are a picture, but the words have meaning. And the interesting thing is if you compare that, the Wunderlich, which is marks on paper, which has a very specific meaning, but it's a language you expect to see in a picture, whereas words are not the language you expect to see in a picture. Words have weight, and as Joseph says, people use language to disguise meaning. Right, this is the last slide of my little thing. This is a Peter Blake from the same set, again stretching the boundaries. It's called Village Fate. The background is a lovingly printed, hand-printed repro of an old oil painting with collage stuff on top. Two levels of activity, 2 totally different graphic languages, pushing and pulling against each other. Really, the last bit that I want to say is about Conrad Atkinson. Conrad was a political artist in many ways. The piece that you saw earlier on, which is Le Monde with the gold on it, again, was very much like an Eduardo enterprise. It was one where he arrived with a newspaper, he arrived with an idea that it was to be erased. And I like the idea that the whole point about a newspaper is you can read it. But in Conrad's newspaper, you can't read it. And the reason you can't read it is because it's been overwritten by gold, by a symbol of greed. It's a message for our age. I think I'll stop there and we can talk later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kip, for these insights into the working process and also for your beautiful reflections on the works that you shared with us. Our next speaker is Michael HREBENIAK. He comes to us over from the English faculty here at Cambridge and from Wolfson College. He works on 20th century British and American literature. He's written a book on action writing, Jack Kerouac's Wild Form. He also is very interested and works on visual culture, and he's very involved with the arts. In fact, I happened to meet him through the artist Richard Wentworth. I have heard over lunch that Michael also just so happens to be a filmmaker, and will be screening a film of his at the Whitechapel Gallery very soon. And I'm very excited that he's agreed to come here and talk to us about the material from a different disciplinary perspective, that of literature. And he will speak about one of the very central works, the Louise Bourgeois, in the show. Thanks, Michael.
Right, good afternoon, and thanks to Lisa for the invitation and to Downing for the wonderful hospitality. So the subject of this rather circuitous talk will be the French-American artist Louise Bourgeois and her 1947 book, He Disappeared into Complete Silence, which has been called the most significant artist book of the interwar era, and which really sets a tone for this most innovative exhibition at the Heong. Now, in common with many of the works on view here, Bourgeois' focus on the materiality of linguistic signs in printmaking invites a consideration of the transactions between text and image as both production and frustration of communication. And as I aim to demonstrate very briefly, this is a characteristic feature of modernism across the disciplines. Now, the core inquiries of Louise Bourgeois' work were forged in the Parisian Surrealist milieu of the 1930s, where she studied prior to emigrating to New York in 1938. Here she would blaze a resolutely idiosyncratic trail over 7 decades, being all but ignored until her first retrospective at MoMA in 1982. Now, while her work adhered to neither school nor formalist doctrine, it nonetheless signalled a quiet attention to the successive movements of her time, from existentialism to conceptualism and postmodernism, as New York established itself as the epicenter of the avant-garde from mid-century. By the 1960s, her fascination with the body as the performative site of the psyche gave rise to a unique art, fusing autobiography, memory, and archetypal ferocity that the women's movement would later discharge across political terrains. The Destruction of the Father from 1974 anticipates the rash of installations that would proliferate across international galleries. Her monumental towers and spiders, which inaugurated Tate Modern in 2000, serving to conflate sculpture with architecture. Common themes throughout were the pitiless exploitation of vulnerability that had biographical origins, in her humiliation at the hands of her bullying and betraying father, and the medical experience of draining the welts from her adored mother's back as a child. Accordingly, her mixed media work unleashed a peculiar psychodrama, its visceral aggression undeniable, a detonating fury across the field of sexual relations. "Pain is the business I am in," she once observed, hence her fascination with the viscous, shattering traditional elements to engineer almost unimaginable combines of dismemberment and fragmentation in the figures of succubi and the implements of castration executed on paper, across wall and in marble. Her characteristic motifs, biomorphic spirals, orbs, cocoons, coils, boxes, houses, breasts, phalluses, are poised between dream and wakened states. They initiate feelings of the uncanny, summon those archetypal forces that are identified with surrealism, while refusing the movement's rather programmatic Freudianism. So these are studies in tactile illusion and disruption, where one material is made to mimic another or appear at odds with its inherent character. Hard objects are made to look soft when played off against our knowledge of the sight and touch of bodily surfaces. These tableaux vivants and sculptural enclosures don't so much transform objects has created an entirely new visual, haptic, and spatial experience, enforcing new ways of apprehending the world of bodies and materials all around us. Now, with the creation of her self-published portfolio, He Disappeared into Complete Silence in 1947, Bourgeois takes a first step into intaglio printmaking. And this signals something of an independent stylistic breakthrough for her, announcing her distancing from painting. Consisting of 9 parables and etchings, this work yields an eerie world, inhabited in a condition of existential absurdity, isolation, and miscommunication, and of course, inexplicable violence. Its ostensible frame suggests a biographical history, starting with the tale of a woman waiting in silence and ending in the post-human prospect of a New York flooded by the Hudson River. All of these parables share a common feature of beings on the perilous thresholds of indeterminacy. Diverse temporalities come together in a disjunctive, hallucinatory experience, and this is reflected in the accompanying geometrical and anthropomorphic engravings of displacement, the whole giving rise to an existential crisis of human abstraction, which perhaps is felt rather than communicated. Now, such an impulse, of course, moves within a wider continuum of non-mimesis, which extends back far beyond modernism. In a 1954 book concerned with Piero della Francesca, Bernard Berenson praises the Renaissance master's ability to withhold any manifestation of expression and resist the overbearing transmission of feeling that might prescribe how a viewer identifies with the subject. As he observes, the fresco of the battle between Heraclius and Chosroes features scarcely any facial registration of emotion. You can see this in the detail of the rather stiffly vertical trooper plunging a dagger into the throat of a youth. The baptism of Christ, as well, is hardly possessed with the euphoria of a transcendent awakening, being more a dazed crawling out of a slumber. And throughout such work, a figure's facial appearance and his or her function start to pare away. The Uffizi portraits of the Duke and Duchess of Urbino are conceived as objects in nature, rather than flesh and blood, their faces as topographical as landscape against which the one they're set. They seem to exist in themselves, eschewing the signals of momentary feeling. So in refusing lyricism, such work seems emphatically anti-romantic, avoiding any sense of gestural inflation, which in our age of normative hysteria across media seems, if anything, expressively inept. To Berenson, however, Della Francesca's dissociative coolness yields a positive quality of non-communication, what he calls a principle of ineloquence. So, if eloquence signifies, as the Oxford English Dictionary indicates, an expressive persuasiveness, a fluency in speaking and writing, then its antonym, ineloquence, implies inarticulacy, a muteness devoid of expressive urgency. Berenson assigns this non-communicative quality to many works across the early modern period, including Goya's portrait of the Cardinal, and he traces it back to ancient art, as, for example, the non-committal 4,000-year-old head of Gudea, and you will note the subsequent damage to the effective area of the face, which is characteristic of iconoclastic attack. He also takes this principle forward to modernism, as in Cézanne's Card Players, and in Van Gogh's self-portrait. And in each case, the subjects seem to us immobile. They're found in a condition of sheer existence, which makes no acknowledgement of or appeal to our presence. Our gaze at them is never returned. Meaning is found not within personality, but forged within the classical principle of action. So both Della Francesca and Louise Bourgeois, and I'm aware of the jarring effect of bringing these two names together, but I'm afraid it's about to get even worse in 30 seconds' time. They register scenarios of stupendous violence, but their respective gestures really claim little in the way of an insight into what can be thought of as an individual subjectivity. And I'd argue that much of the power of Bourgeois' work is similarly found in the inexpressive, the non-gesticulatory. If anything, the concept of psychology in her work is an absent referent, an interiority that's not necessarily inconceivable, but one that remains inaccessible to our gaze. Neither can Bourgeois' indifference to given standards of physical beauty, with a concentration instead upon bulk, on weight, and on force, be dismissed as a mere primitivist return. Her husband, by the way, Robert Goldwater, had written one of the seminal books on primitivism, called Primitivism in Modern Painting in 1938, which Bourgeois credited with demystifying the subject for her. I think this could instead be regarded as part of modernism's wider concern with jettisoning realism through the self-conscious raising of the material surface of the work across disciplines. So in terms of literature, Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest from 1895 might seem a rather strange point of departure, but by some bizarre work of coincidence, Berenson drops Oscar Wilde's name in his book in a rather gratuitous anecdote about a shared lunch. Now, regarded ostensibly as a rather charming drawing room comedy, I'd rather think of The Importance of Being Earnest as a radical and coded resistance of sexual repression, which is carried off through an extraordinarily experimental attitude towards language that 70 years later will become known as deconstruction in academic circles. It's an approach that actively problematizes the representation of inner life. Now, this play is built upon a discrete series of witty exchanges that only notionally propel forward the plot, which of course is a traditional function of dialogue in a play. So on the surface, these epigrams are supremely eloquent, but structurally, in terms of the play's function, they're the very opposite. Communication is frustrated by self-cancelling exchanges, each protagonist's speech turning in upon itself to resist the possibility of dialogue. The motivation of speakers is one-upmanship. It's more their speech is more reminiscent of the mechanical patter of vaudeville comedians, with speakers narcissistically imprisoned in their own egos. The butler's first retort, as you can see, to Algernon, a question over his pianism, "I didn't think it polite to listen, sir," rather sets the tone. No one listens. Interlocution is an impossibility. The possibility of the social collapses. Speech fails to communicate both moral concern and interiority alike. The characters are mere ciphers. For example, Jack kills his linguistic brother by language alone, via the line, "Bunbury is exploded." Clichés are invoked throughout in a deadpan style to express feelings conventional to melodrama, which are denied by the triteness of the play's tone and its content. So comedy, that traditional vehicle of asserting heteronormativity, and Oscar Wilde dutifully here rehearses this through a dramatic trajectory that resolves in the marriage of two couples after a temporary cathartic incursion into confusion and deviance. He does this, but he does it in such a farcical way, through an over-stylized dialogue and through a ludicrously baroque plot, that he effectively rubbishes from within the very serviceability of the comedy genre, and he implicitly casts doubt upon the viability or the naturalness of heterosexual union that it carries. In the context of Wilde's own persecution for indecency in the very same year as the play's debut in 1895, this new slipperiness towards language and the refusal of its communicative powers could be seen as liberatory, the nature of Wilde's attack being necessarily oblique. Wilde, of course, was accused of an unnatural act, which he described at his trial as the love that dare not speak its name. Homosexuality is literally unspeakable, a condition of enforced silence that we can term disarticulated. Wilde, of course, cannot write an overly pro-gay work in late 19th century London, although that said, the play contains plenty of examples of subcultural polarity that would have resonated with a Wildean in-crowd. And this includes the titular word earnest, which meant gay in the contemporary London underground, which is a fair summation of the play's real power that lies in the dazzling transactions between the two key male actors. So Oscar Wilde must then represent the rituals of heteronormativity as artificial, by refusing the signifying properties of language that pronounce his own sexuality abnormal and deviant. So what we get here is a nihilistic strategy of non-communication that opens a potential space for homoerotic desire from within sanctioned cultural forms. Now, obviously, this theme has points of commonality with Bourgeois' wider work, which is overtly concerned with critiques of gender identity, behaviour, and their renegotiation. I'd also go so far as to suggest that the separate and the distinct languages of text and image in bourgeoisie disappeared into complete silence are elevated to a not dissimilar independent existence beyond the concrete world, which we'll return to in a moment. Wilde's attitude to language also prefigures, I think, the absurdist drama of Samuel Beckett and Harold Pinter, where language is used as an aggressive smokescreen, an agency of anti-communication, which is used to conceal the degradation of both inner and outer life. Where the protagonists are ventriloquized by fragments of language they've picked up, intercepted, and recycled without agency. And where the notion of subjectivity or personality or character is supplanted by that of the ventriloquist dummy. Language speaks the protagonists in both cases, not vice versa. So note the closing of Beckett's Waiting for Godot from 1955, where the outer phase dialogue of the two clochards concludes with the injunction to go, that's expressly then defied by the stage direction, they do not move. In Harold Pinter's Birthday Party from 1958, we hear this facile simulation of an East End Jewish uncle, his bonhomie rehearsed by the sinister figure of Goldberg from the organisation, which is entirely inconsistent with his terroristic purpose of menace. Wilde's work also, I think, obliquely prefigures the Dada movement, founded in January 1916 in the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, as an expressly anti-war movement. It is clear by then, of course, that World War I has degenerated into insane mass technological sacrifice. One therefore cannot engage dialectically with the morality of such a war, as to do so will be to reproduce the constitutive language and the logic that justified it in the first place, and therefore reinforce its inherent madness. So Dada activists such as Kurt Schwitters, Hugo Ball, and Tristan Tzara respond by refusing the entire Western value system of sovereign common sense, which is underpinned by patriarchy, rationalism, progress, religion, nationalism, and of course, the moral improvements of art, by junking its expressive forms. The word Dada is just made for our purpose, reported Richard Holzenbeck later in 1927. The child's first sound expresses the primitivist, the beginning at zero, the new in our art. Hence Dada's use of non-semantic sounds, noises, and performative inventions, including a rather reductive primitivism, as a meta-language that might disrupt the signifying basis of a genocidal military-industrial complex. The result is what the French theorist Roland Barthes, in writing Degree Zero, describes as the loosening of language from social styling and its movement into flux, a desired return of language to what he calls point zero. Such considerations might also extend to the performing arts, an example of the dancer Merce Cunningham, in particular, who broke with Martha Graham's company in 1945 to design a choreography that liberated the body from musical representation and narrative continuity. To quote the composer, John Cage, his collaborator and partner over 5 decades, as in abstract painting, it is assumed that an element, a movement, a sound, a change of light, is in and of itself expressive. What it communicates is in large part determined by the observer himself. It's assumed that the dance supports itself and doesn't need support from the music. The two arts take place in common place and time, but each art expresses its space-time in its own way. The result is an activity of interpenetrations in time and space, not counterpoints nor control relationships, but flexibilities. Elements within each subsequent performance are no longer conceived with the intention of provoking psychological recognition within an audience. As Cage suggests, whereas other music and dance generally attempt to say something, this theatre is one that presents activity. This can be said to affirm life. So I think this perhaps illuminates the world of Bourgeois. He disappeared into complete silence. Although she described it as a drama of the self, that self is conspicuously impossible to locate within the book's forms and its constructions. Each of the 9 stories is perfunctory, elliptical, its language unadorned, as are the semi-automatic, unevenly hand-scratched line drawings, which are left uncoloured in the original version. Obvious surrealist influences underscore these laconic and sarcastic parables on relationships between men and women that are accompanied by eerily empty, elongated buildings. Gaston Bachelard, in The Poetics of Space, notably attributes the symbolic insecurity to a lack of graduated foundations in the drawings of some children. So the image and the text here are arranged as a sequential narrative, although Bourgeois cautioned against linking the prints too closely to the narratives, and quite rightly so. For there is a pronounced instability and fragmentation, both within and between each image and block of text. While attempts at representation are borderline defective, and we're never fully able to break free of the constraints of the book's own coded systems, the work's dynamic charge is not especially cerebral. The text calls up the memory of given forms, of fables, of fairy tales, in their seeming simplicity and rite of passage violence. The rhetorical device of once, which so many of these parables start with, perhaps serves as an establishing shot. But this expectation is always unfulfilled. Communication flashes up as a possibility. The text image is haunted by the spectre of legibility, but then it immediately recedes, propelling us into a cognitive dissonance. Events within both word and image are not the same as the world itself. The text is not a substitute, but a supplement to the world. Let's have a look at plate number 6, Leprosarium Louisiana. Note, of course, a shadowy echo of Bourgeois' own name, as well as a reference to the Carville Institution, which opened in 1917. Does the text represent the image, or the image represent the text? The engraving doesn't really resemble an asylum, and therefore falls considerably short of representation. So which system serves as the primary perception, and which has a secondary function of memory, comparison, or illustration? Perhaps each form stands as autonomous in itself, being cast into an unstable mutual commentary. Of course, literature, from its privileged relation to Aristotle's notion of poiesis, has traditionally enjoyed a status as the master category of art, as it's philosophically understood. But here, language, literature, text, discourse loses its dominance. Language traditionally, of course, plays no part in the representational function of classical paintings, which affirms a common ground of understanding. And in these prints, the use of the text is always disruptive. The bonds of the linguistic sign and the visual elements seem to unravel in front of us. Language enters into an uncertain relation, confused with drawing itself, and then loses its common ground. So this is perhaps not a temporal narrative, but a spatial work of the concomitant, the adjacent, the side by side, the relational and non-relational. The image immediately decomposes and disappears, leaving as its trace its own absence. In plate 2, the solitary death of the Woolworth building announces the absence of its own subject. Its performative trace in the consciousness of the viewer is further recalled and then cancelled by the oddly inverted, unbalanced pairs of what could be thought of as skyscrapers. The image itself, along with the name it bears, loses its identity. Voice slips between figure and ground. So if anything, that trace of narrative sense within and between forms that are knitted together here is doubly destabilizing, as a series of non-affirmative verbal statements are brought into play with disoriented volumes and unmapped spaces. So to conclude, I could admit that even this coy reading of Bourgeois' work is nothing more than a presumptuous form of communication. For Bourgeois' subjectivity in this book, and indeed throughout all of her work, remains elusive. She remains practiced at the art of disengaging herself from the tiresome responsibility of communicating a message, wherein an artist and her work are obliged to interfuse. While invariably haunted by the cultural memory of prior forms, experiences, and meanings, Bourgeois' uncanny and ineloquent art is not a representation but a presentation, one that expressly resists easy consumption. And just as her visual and textual forms cannot be reduced to skeletonized meaning or paraphrase, the narrative of each human life too is similarly irreducible to anything other than itself, which is to say that when it comes to the making of the new in art, as in life, communication is neither entirely possible nor necessarily desirable. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this beautiful talk and for really giving us this much, much wider historical arc for our theme. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm afraid the artist Amalia Pica could not join us today for unforeseen circumstances, but she has shared with us a film that we'd like to screen for you. It is I should just say by way of introduction, Amalia Pica is a London-based Argentinian artist whose work explores metaphor, communication, and civic participation. She works across a variety of different media, including everyday objects, obsolete technologies, and also film. And her work, Corner Construction, is the beautiful collage piece in the exhibition. Amalia is shown at an impressive range of institutions: the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, at the Guggenheim Museum, the Venice Biennale, Tate Modern, Modern Art Oxford, the MIT List Center, and Heong Gallery in London, to name only just a few places. Perona, are you going to put up exactly the film? Actually, we've been given a statement to read along with it, so I'm going to read it perhaps while we get ready for the screening.
Christina, could we have the lights down, please? Thank you.
One moment.
Yeah.
Okay. The film is from 2018, from this year. It's 13 minutes long. It is entitled The Catalogue of Great Ape Gestures, so it takes us into the realm of intra-species communication, I imagine. The statement I'm going to read is very brief. It's just the label for the piece that was written by Volker Sommer, who is a professor of evolutionary anthropology at University College London, for which this piece was made. And he's written, "Rather than trying to teach human systems to animals, we could rely on their own long-established methods to communicate with them. In fact, at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, primatologists led by Richard Bine compiled a great ape dictionary. The assemblage of gestures applied by wild gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and bonobos reveals a surprising congruence across the different species, pointing to a shared evolutionary past. Apes, like artists, seem to have means to render visible what cannot be spoken. The researchers catalogued dozens of common gestures from arms wave, beckon, clap, and dangle to stroke and tandem walk. The dance choreography follows the ape repertoire in its artificial alphabetical order, ultimately the reenacting illustrates the limits of interspecies communication if one party prioritizes its own system."
Our sincerest apologies. There was sound. We tested it this morning. It seems to have stopped. Just give me a second. I will fix it.
Let's hope for the best. Can all the speakers please join me? The exhibition had a great diversity of work, and if I'm now thinking of just how that material has been contextualized here this afternoon, it really reinforces that sense that communication is a very broad topic with very many different aspects, and if there's anything I can say to try and sort of pull things together, my sense is that technology seems to keep getting better, giving us sort of ever more sort of seamless and faster communication, and yet sort of the problem at the heart of it, I suppose, is of a rather different nature, not one of sort of ever better and ever more seamless data streams. John, would you agree?
Yes. Yeah, I think that in part is something that I'm trying to gesture to in trying to situate communication historically as connected to discourses that were really about technology, and to see how there's an emphasis on seamless communication and on clarity, and yet that's something that I think many of us could say just in daily life, that having our smartphones all the time, having connections to the internet, computers, social media, I mean, we're also experiencing this sense of too much information, a lack of clarity because of technology that's supposed to be clarifying, and that type of confusion is something that many artists are thinking about. How can their art sort of frustrate the models of clarity that have been put forth and given to us?
What I'd like to do is, because we are already at 4 p.m. I would like to open it up immediately to the audience. All 4 speakers are available for questions. Please.
Just wait for the microphone, then you can get it for posterity.
Though that shouldn't intimidate anyone from
Just works. Hi, thanks for the papers. It was really interesting. I'm just wondering, I mean, to me, a kind of pretty strong parallel to the signal noise is kind of langue parole semiotics. Just if you can comment on the technological cybernetic discourse of misunderstanding and meaning versus symbol, and how that fits in Saussurian semiotics.
And so how that fits with semiotics.
Well, yeah, because it's happening at the same time.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, there is some research that suggests, and I'm not, it's not something I know too much about, but tracing the influence of information theory into various linguistic theories. So, I mean, there's some figures that come to mind immediately to me. Someone like Noam Chomsky, for example, linguist, is also at MIT, and he is starting his work in he's hired by MIT to work on various military-related projects dealing with radar, for example, and communication technologies. So he uses that experience and a model that's really based in technology, and that influences his own reading of linguistics. But there are other connections between semiotics and sort of rereadings of works by Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener in philosophy or in other fields. So the same dynamic that I'm sort of gesturing towards, which is this like artistic representation or reception of theories and ideas in the natural and social sciences, is happening outside of the arts per se, for sure, absolutely.
Well, just as an anthropologist, this is structuralist linguistics are the foundation for understandings of the myth. So when you link signal noise to fake news, there's a lot of resonances with kind of Levi-Strauss, the foundations of the myth globally.
And there is some research that sort of draws those historical connections to a figure like Levi-Strauss, for example. I can give you a citation after we're done.
Michael, it looks like you wanted to add to this.
I just want to ask John, actually. I mean, the area you're talking about is also that of seminal advances in ecology. And,
Yes.
I keep thinking of the figure of Gregory Bateson.
Yeah,
Mind
and he's
and Nature.
present also. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously with, he has a relationship with Margaret Mead. He's, I don't know exactly if it's at the Macy conferences, but he's also another figure that's very much tied to the reception of these theories and the sort of import of that theory into anthropology. Sorry, but I interrupted your...
No, that was kind of what I was looking for. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about maybe that interface between ecology and cybernetics? Because Bateson has this rather lovely phrase about feedback mechanisms called the cybernetic significances of Zen, I think it is, something like that.
Okay.
Are you familiar with this?
I'm not immediately familiar.
Put you on the spot.
And so the question is just elaborating more
on how those
ecological
fields
resonances.
are mutually informing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that, the thing that's interesting about information theory and cybernetics is that they are really directly tied to technology and to engineering specifically, and they both have this sort of troubled historical origin because they're linked to military technologies. And ecology, there is a sort of another field, systems theory, which is very much connected to cybernetics and information theory. However, systems theory is more clearly linked to ideas coming out of biology. So even in the early 20th century, I'm blanking on names, but I can give you some names after our session, looking at how cells function, biology, similar principles of homeostasis in the body, and how that, it has a sort of biological origin. And that is a root for a lot of ecological thought that emerges in the 60s and then into the 70s. So there's a sort of a dual lineage, an engineering one and then a biological one that's maybe less tainted. And they sort of converge into models for ecology. So it's definitely, absolutely an origin for that as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Lisa, I wonder if I can
Yes,
ask a
Catherine,
question.
please.
I just wanted to ask you, Kip, if you don't mind. I'm very interested in the relationship between artists who make prints.
Should we put the microphone a bit closer? Where are you? Thanks.
No, I'm very interested in the relationship between artists and master printers, and it's something that I've been doing some work on recently, working on the art of Cora Walker. And I was just thinking about communication and the meaning of work. I wonder if you could just say something about how important it is to you as a printer to understand the artist's intentions when they set about making a print.
Okay, my first point of contact generally is to go and visit the artists in their studio and see whether they sharpen their pencils in order of hardness. Whether I'm not joking. The nature of their obsessions is very important, and I have to, in a way you'd understand, get to know them so that a lot of the decisions that are made, which are non-verbal, are shared, so that the inflection in a colour which defies description, it's not a yellow, it's not a blue, it's not a grey, it's something that we both know, can be developed. And that and the attachment to just the world of the physical, so it's what happens when you put one thing on another and so on, is very important. More important in this context is understanding what their vocabulary is, the area that they're trying to open up with a visual language. And it may be that it's down to one shape pointing to another so that they energize each other. It may be one cultural reference against another. But that has to be understood. So, to answer your question as quickly as I can, yes, I really need to know what they're about.
And does that alter the kind of suggestions you might make in terms of the technique that they use, and that will influence that, will it? Or
well, the medium has to suit the message, because often the message is actually part of the medium. I mean, you handle lots of paper and lots of prints, and the surface is as important as the image. it's very complicated.
Thank you.
We have a question in the audience over there.
Yeah, it's for Kip, really. I wonder if you could say something about those occasions where you've come to meet an artist and you've thought, however hard I try, we're not going to kind of, I mean, the non-spoken or the communication. So we might be looking at the place where communication isn't possible. So that would be quite interesting to hear about.
Right, I'll give you two. One was working with an American artist who refused to, I said, well, I can come and see you. And she said, no, it's all right. I'll just send you an image and I want you to make a print of it. And I said, well, why don't you just go around to the print shop round the corner and, get them to crack some out, because that's not what I do. That's as far as that one went. And I'm sad about it, but that's how it was. The other day, I was working with a Down syndrome girl, and her drawing ability is utterly extraordinary. Her verbal communication is zero. And we got along like a house on fire. So those are two sort of opposite extremes. I've said to somebody else before, when you go and see your doctor, you assume that your doctor will treat you as any other patient. And if you have a great relationship with your doctor, you'll think, I've got a nice doctor. If you have a difficult relationship with your doctor, you'll probably find another one. But it's the assumption that their approach to you will be even-handed. If I'm cast in the role of the doctor, I wouldn't say I'm even-handed. I have my favourites.
I was also wondering about, we know our own limits, the limits of our own understanding, and what you're talking about is a collaborative process. And so how you might feel where you maybe meet a mind that you feel, well, I'd like to take this somewhere, but because of obviously our work moves us on, and I'm not trying to ask you to speak about your limitations exactly, but I'm in this context of looking at communication and where it ends, and where our own kind of little hooks might end.
I think there are kinds of work that I wouldn't make for all sorts of reasons, and probably, as you say, the fact that I wouldn't go there means that, and the fact that I can't explain why would show where my limitations are. But there have been other people who've reduced me to tears with the intensity of their obsession. So, was it Del Boy said, the plectrum is very big, meaning the spectrum. I'm sorry.
Other questions from the audience? Prerona, did you have a question? Or no?
I did have a question, but I'm happy to defer. Okay. My question is sort of connected to what both Catherine and Kip were saying. It's more about the history of printmaking and political printmaking, and how there are certain divergences between what happens in America and what happens in Britain. So I would imagine that in the 60s and 70s it was Kelpra that was kind of flying the flag in Britain. So Chris Prater and Kelpra were the first people to get a big kind of, Chris Prater was the first person to get a big sort of show of his printmaking at the Hayward, for example. But we're doing very different kinds of prints compared to the ones that we just saw. So if you have a comment on why the British side of things might not have been that political, or if it had been, I might just not know about it, but Kitai is not as direct as some of the other artists you've shown. And Kip, I was wondering whether institutional structures, so ULEA is still growing strong, Kelpra wound up because it was two people and they retired. So do you think institutional sort of recognition of this as a trade that gets passed on and kind of carried on under these big banners is important?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it is to do with the workshops. I think there weren't the same kind of innovative, forward-thinking print workshops in the UK at that time in the 60s as there were in America. Not to the same degree, and perhaps not attracting the same kind of big-name artists. And also, I think it's to do with museums and galleries as well. Perhaps, you know, I mentioned the big show of Gemini prints at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, staged in 1971, and there were lots of kind of pop art shows that included prints in the US in the 60s, and I think it was perhaps also there were fewer print exhibitions being mounted in the UK, but quite a few American artists did actually make work over here. Ed Ruscha, Jim Dine, people like that made work in London. And in terms of politics, I think maybe there weren't the same kind of big movements that artists got involved in the UK as there were in the US during this period. The things like the civil rights movement and protests against Vietnam really kind of brought artists and visual artists as well as musicians and writers together to kind of work towards this sort of common goal. And although of course there was a huge amount of protests against the government in this country as well, I think that they just weren't those same kind of big movements, organised movements in the UK.
Okay, I'll start by saying that the person who started me printing is sitting in this front row here, which is rather nice. I think that the historical perspective is very confused. First of all, the technological revolution in screen printing was firmly based with Kelpra. The tradition of lithography had been carried by Kerwin for ages, but it was very traditional in its approach. It was the effect of the Tamarind studio and June Wayne that really re-energized American printmaking on one level. But carry in your head the kick of raw printmaking in Paris in the 60s, and the way that kind of message, the power of the press, that's the real deal. All this stuff that we make, using beautiful paper and teasing stuff out of artists and everything, that's okay. But the real belt of the press is what you saw with the Parisian students. And I guess what I crave is that kind of energy to be in our museums and galleries, so that the reality of existence is thrown right up. Occasionally I get to work with somebody very good. I made some lovely lollipop sticks which had the words, "I used to have birds all around me," written onto them. I think it's a good environmental statement.
I'll have a question for Michael, and to be honest, it's really an understanding question. Your talk was incredibly clear, and yet because I've been working with a slightly different framework, I'm still getting my head around it. So the way I've been thinking is that prior to modernism, you had representation, so a form of communication, but because of the rise of technology, that role was in a way taken away from the visual arts. In modernism, no aim for communication, and afterwards kind of communication as a sort of theme or problem. And I just wonder, by giving us this much wider historical arc that you've given us that goes all the way back into the Renaissance, how that's complicating what I've been saying.
Wow. I guess you have to go back to Gutenberg, 1429, the invention of movable type and the printing press, and the movement towards a dominant culture of visuality in the West. As you say, these are superseded from the mid-19th century, daguerreotype, etc., photography. But I guess really what I'm interested in the modernist era is that loss of confidence in that Enlightenment project that comes really with the technological apocalypse of the First World War. And that necessity to move away from the dialectical to the disruptive as a political gesture. I mean, I think that's one of the things that comes out of this lovely exhibition, is a sense that I think, John, you were saying that there's a kind of banality to the way the texts are transmitted. And what we get is a slowdown. You know, we are forced into the position of being critics rather than consumers in something like this. And I think this is something, it's such a huge question. It actually does roll back through the decades to the very beginning of the 20th century, where that necessity of slowing down, where you become a producer of language rather than a consumer of discourse, is very important. You're no longer composed from without by the text. It is enforcing a more interrogative reading. In view of the fact that, you know, the human being has been subject to the most brutal genocidal forms of technological intervention because of the First World War. So somehow you've got to pull clear of the very signifying systems upon which this is built. Hence that need to become not only a reader but a critic at the same time. So I think a lot of the work, probably the best way of answering your question, is to say that it strikes me that the work on show amongst within these prints is both an expression and also a critique of expression. It gives a commentary on its own impossibilities, as well as, I mean, you could read this stuff in about 5 minutes if you want, you'll miss it.
Thank you. Yes.
I've just really enjoyed reading David Jones in parenthesis. And just in relation to what you just said, I think almost one could imagine a different trajectory for how artists could have responded to. So perhaps more like the image that you just suggested with the tree on the lollipop stick, you know, where there's such an amazing density of layering of meaning within a very small space of time. I don't know if there's something you could say about that as another stream of the response.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think the question of collage is very important in Jones. You know, the bringing together all these different forms. And of course, this is a very significant visual culture, this magnificent poem. And the incredible calligraphy of Jones, and the sense that this is a holistic production. You know, there are beautiful drawings. The text itself is magnificently cut. So I think I don't know if you've heard him read it. It's phenomenal. Yeah. So I think on that level, there's another important thing coming in that there's a transaction between the visual and the oral cultures of a text, which we must never forget, and someone like Jones, I think, brings that to the fore. But the idea of the return of the body to the text, and this beautiful cutting, getting away from the fact of the homogenized reproduction of normative forms of text, etc. I mean, he's a really good example, a bit of an outlier figure, but it's a completely different tradition, perhaps, to the one we've been discussing and immersed in today. Although Kip might take issue with that.
Okay, I can give you a parallel which might reveal something. I did a body of work with a great non-figurative artist called Michael Brick, and it illustrated the poetry of Fernando Pessoa. And Pessoa wrote under a number of different names, heteronyms, and one of the more interesting was it's fled me. But the thing is that all of these separate poets were brilliant, and each one had a different CV, and Alberto Cairo was the name of the writer. And he became so successful that Pessoa, who had invented him, had to murder him. But the thing about the writing is it's like an instruction on how to look. And there's one which contains the words something like this in English translation. Although poets might have it otherwise, moonlight seen through the trees is only moonlight seen through the trees. And given the nature of the non-figurative accompaniments to this, which were a series of geometric forms that followed one another through it, it's absolutely on, you know, that what you see is what you see, and what you hear is what you hear. But it doesn't mean that it's unpoetic, it's just what you see. Sorry, does that get you anywhere nearer?
Fine.
I don't really have a question per se, but given that there's been this signal processing and communication lab at Cambridge for so long, and it's now playing such a big role in technologies like Siri and Alexa, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, just because of its proximity, and whether you've seen any artistic responses to that yet.
Someone who's in Cambridge will have to take that question. I'm afraid I don't know myself. Verona, do you know something?
I'm sure it's there, but it might not be collected by museums yet. I think it might take them 2 years to collect it, and then
Can I put a question to our incredibly well qualified academic friends? What is the role of time in all of this? We're looking at very near contemporary work. How does the filtering of time and the changing social context actually alter the work? Please, anyone.
I mean, I would say that it very much depends on the work, and it's in some cases the meaning of work or the understanding of a work can be altered almost immediately when it's removed from the context in which it's first shown. So I talked about some prints that were made to be seen in public and kind of posted on the streets of New York or elsewhere, and you remove them from that situation and you put them into a gallery or somewhere else, and automatically you've removed some of the meaning from the work, or perhaps made it harder for the viewer to understand what the artist intended to mean. And of course, often meaning can become obscured or changed as time passes, and we, as viewers, understand less about the context in which the work was made. So I think, speaking as a curator, you know, we do, I mean, there's a trend at the moment in museums and galleries to offer very little interpretation and almost have no kind of label text at all, but I would resist that, partly because I think it is important to give a viewer of a work, of an historical work, some context, because some viewers will understand aspects of the work because they may have lived at that time it was made, but other viewers won't, and of course we're never going to be seeing it in the place it was first intended to be shown after that initial exhibition or display.
That's a really interesting point, coming from someone who very deeply embedded within the museum world as well. Because it always struck me that 1917 is really the great turning point with Duchamp's Fountain, which in itself expressly reposes upon the idea of removing something from a context. You know, the fact that you're showing a piss pot, you've got a new definition of art. No kind of romanticism hang-ups anymore about being in contact with the Godhead. Art is now selection, assemblage, naming, performance, removal. And that and so much of the stuff we've seen downstairs is very context independent, isn't it? I think, and I wonder if that's something to do, of course, with the rise of the gallery as a kind of market space where currency becomes perhaps the most significant aspect of visual cultural performance. You know, money, transactional. I mean, it's amazing to think there's so many new British artists. Their work is immediately bought by Whitehall. Apparently, Whitehall is stuffed full of Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin and Chapman Brothers. You know, so it immediately loses its countercultural aegis, its power. You know,
Absolutely.
interrogate.
Yeah.
It's sucked in, recuperated.
Yeah, and of course the trajectory of the artist's career as well can change the work. I mean, somebody like Damien Hirst, who now is kind of commanding these huge prices and is no longer seen as a countercultural figure. We view their work differently because of the way the artist has changed, as well as the context in which the work is shown. So but I mean, I think in terms of offering interpretation in the museum, I think it's always a choice. So viewers don't have to read it. Viewers don't have to consume it. They can just go and see Duchamp's fountain and not read anything about it and just appreciate it for the object that it is.
Two bits. One, it is possible that Duchamp's fountain was never in the Armoury show at all. And it was fabricated afterwards. That's even more exciting. I mean, that really, really compounds the nature of the object and its meaning. That's the first thought. The second is, we were looking at Sue Coe's Trump image. Let's be 500 years down the road and somehow it survived. How will it be?
Well, I mean that is the difficult thing with presenting these kind of these works that are made as a very immediate response to something, because they're often very nuanced with kind of very particular references. I mean, I talked about how the title of that work, Unprecedented, refers to a tweet that Trump made, and in which he misspelt a word. And is that something that people will remember do people remember that now, even just a couple of years later, a year after it was made? And I think that is why we do need to kind of keep the records of these works. We can't just assume that people will understand these references in 100 years' time. And when we're looking at Hogarth, for example, we have to kind of read about the society in which Hogarth was making those prints in order to fully understand everything that he was trying to say. And even then we might not understand everything he was trying to say.
But what interests me is the fact that Hogarth's work survived because it was seen to be important and had been collected or owned by somebody. It's how much, the Parisian posters that I was talking about, there are very few that survive. It's what works its way down through history, and maybe, as somebody said, it's the institution's role to steer that. I don't know.
Maybe, but maybe we should also accept that a meaning of a work may change over time to people, and maybe that's fine. Maybe it doesn't matter that we completely remember the artist's intention.
I see 2 questions, 3 questions, yeah.
In terms of the context and meaning, I think Jenny Holzer, who's in the exhibition, is very, very good at repositioning her work using billboards and neon lighting, and she's online as well and collecting narratives and displaying them in different ways in different places. I saw a huge exhibition of her work at the Baltic a few years ago, and it's very, very different to see just the one little strip here and how it sits very differently. So I think in terms of context and meaning, it's not just across history, it's also how an artist chooses to reposition themselves within their own lifetime and with their own work, and reposition their work within their own, playing with their work in that sense.
Yeah.
So could somebody kind of comment on that maybe, or because it's very much based in the exhibition that we have got here then?
I think just to say something about Jenny Holzer, we have at the British Museum, we have a series of prints made by her called Inflammatory Essays, which are it's a series of 10 prints using text printed on different pieces of coloured paper, and each is a kind of a rant or a sort of political kind of statement about a different subject. So one is about guns, one is about freedom. You know, there are all these kind of different things, and they kind of remind you of people who might be kind of standing on a street corner somewhere ranting about a particular topic in a very kind of worked up way. And when Holzer made these prints in the 80s, she pasted them anonymously around New York, so they were seen out there on the street, which made that connection between these people who were kind of talking about politics, about society on the street. She's since displayed, as we have at the British Museum, she's displayed these prints in various museums and galleries and various exhibitions. And because of they're all square and they're all different colours, what she's often done with them is she's taken several sets of this portfolio and she's made patterns with the coloured squares, so that you almost see kind of minimalist imagery coming, you know, from the installation. The installation of these works becomes like a sort of grid, or sometimes sort of blocks of colour that you see in patterns. And so she really she's really taken that work from its origins as kind of anonymous posters on the streets of New York saying something about the various voices in society that are trying to be heard, and actually taken the work into a museum environment and presented it with references to various art movements in America, and referencing artists such as Bryce Marden and Donald Judd. So it's interesting how that work has changed in meaning in the different ways that it's been presented.
I think we had 2 more questions, and then I think we'll also need to finish.
Okay.
Hi, I was wondering, all the things that you have in common is, you've been discussing, have been universal values. How far do you think, just like in linguistics, do you feel that there's nuances there, which you've mentioned not long ago, but the differences of ideas, concepts, because the language, the currency of the artist has changed from the big institutions, like from going back from Pharaohic times to the church, to kings, to the 50s when there was the government building atomic bombs and big projects, to now we're in the age of the nerds. It's small groups to communicate with one another. They do not have to go through the big institutions, through the mass media, even though the mass media tries to pick groups individually. I'll give an example. One of my students from France, this was even 20 years ago, they have a language in the street. It's not graffiti, but there's a film called 12 Monkeys, and they have little prints on the walls around the cities, and they communicate with one another, and it's running. And people walk past it every day and they don't see it. There's a substructure of art, of that. It's not trying to communicate to other people, but just let them know there's other people doing other things. We have limitations with technologies, not just ideas. For example, the inks from Japan. If somebody wants something printed, I mean, some of the blues that are done in Japan, their inks over there, they're amazing, vibrant. How much does all this take into consideration with the artist, and also with the areas we've been discussing, and how I know it's a long question, this, but I've just put it all into context. How do you assume that it's a universal language that we use? I mean, for example, certain colours are different in one country to another culture. Are we talking to the white Anglo-Saxon world, or do we talk to Western world? Do we talk universal language to somebody in South Africa or South America? These values that we have been discussing today and seeing, some of it's abstract. The exhibitions, are the artists communicating with us, or do we have to communicate with the artist? Are we bridging those information like an advertisement, like television? how far do we break down these universal values that we've been covering today? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Can I have a go? Mm-hmm. Please. Right. It's all about the battle between the universal and the particular. It's the nature of our existence. It's how we measure ourselves. We look around and we look at the universal and we think, here am I. And, like all those things from, Neanderthal times where somebody leaves a mark which carries across time, that's the particular in relation to the universal. And as you were saying about cross-cultural things, white in Japan is death and black is positivity, whereas here it's the other way around. As far as I'm concerned, that's fine. They can read it as they want. As an artist makes a particular statement, and it will be interpreted by somebody else's set of rules. And that's fine. Why should that not be the case? The only thing that I would stress here, though, is that the world has changed. You were saying about the media and so on. Images have begun to be transmitted around in a way that they weren't before. So if you imagine yourself sitting listening to Beethoven's Fifth, knowing you're only going to hear it once in your life, you would listen with different ears from the ears that you used to listen to it on a recording. And in the same way, looking at an image once, a great piece, you would know that was it, and you would look differently. And what I'd encourage is people to look with that attention now, even though it's spread around differently. I'm sorry, I'm a bit evangelical about the nature of visual language, because it's what I work with, but I think it's really important. The signs and signifiers are all around us. For those who have any kind of political bent, the no left turn sign would be an absolute gift to the Tory party, but I want the no right turn sign to go to the other side. Sorry, I apologise. I'll stop now.
I think we'll have our final question then. There was one more question, I think, on the side of the room.
Would you like to ask your question?
Okay, then I think we'll finish here. Thank you so much for coming here, for sharing your thoughts, and thank you all for coming as well, and for your questions.
Thank you so much, Elisa. I have to thank Elisa because she's not thanked herself for putting together the exhibition and creating this panel. And, we've learnt something this afternoon, and that there are not very many kind of rainy Saturday afternoons where we come out enlightened. And also troubled and questioning. And I think if we do all of those things, then the gallery has done its job in organising events like this. The gallery is open a little bit longer today. We'll open it till about 5:30. If you dash to the gallery right now, you might be able to participate in the big draw. We've got a rather cheeky activity of writing your own alternative labels on acetate and sticking them out underneath the works. It's slightly transgressive. I haven't seen the results yet. But thank you so much for coming. The gallery's open till 5:30. We've got a sale on all exhibition items. And before we go, we must give another round of applause to all our panelists today, and have a very good evening. Thank you.